I have come to this building every day and done my job. 3 decades I've given to this office. But honestly, sometimes it scares me. I don't know what we do here. Have I done something wrong?
Someone's walked in from the other side.
The other side,
Whatever you do, don't panic.
Hi, Howard.
Please, do you have any idea how lucky you are? No one gets to meet the other.
Other?
30 years ago, during the Cold War, there was an experiment. Something went wrong. They opened up a passage. When you go through this door, you come out the other side, you're in another world, identical to ours.
There was one reality, and then it duplicated. We share genetics, childhood. I want to know how you became so different. A kill order came out from my side, targeting people on your side. Handle is Baldwin. She's a contract assassin. Your wife may be her next target.
We're caught in the middle of something whether we want to be or not.
You should just build a wall and never come back.
I hate your side for what you've done to ours. You don't know these people like I do. They don't tolerate mistakes.
The last thing you want is me with nothing left to say.
Well, what you just heard was the trailer for the new series on Starz called Counterpart. And I talked about it the other day. This is the new series with J.K. Simmons, who plays the insurance guy on TV. I think it's Allstate. I always get Allstate and State Farm confused. I think it's Allstate. He does the Allstate commercials, and he's got the Disaster Hall of Fame, and he walks people through these various disaster scenarios. So that gives you a visual of who he is. He was also J. Jonah Jameson from the first 2 Spider-Man movies. And this new series it's interesting in that it begins to get into this idea that there are these 2 separate timelines. And I did a little bit of digging around the series, and what I found that at least at a superficial level that I thought was interesting was that Starz seems to specialize in series about time travel and timelines. It's I don't know what the executive order is at Starz, which I think is owned by Showtime or HBO. It's like one of the offshoot channels. Anyway, it's interesting because they have, of course, the romantic version of time travel with the wildly popular Outlander series, which is kind of a cool idea, to be honest with you, because women really dig that show because of the romantic notion, love across time. Love across time. That's a kind of a cool idea. And, guys dig science fiction, and so you kind of rope both parties in on Outlander. They have another series called The Travelers, and that's about a group of people from the future who have come back to the present, and their goal is to alter the future because the future is a pretty fucked up place. And we've heard that one before. That's a pretty common theme. The first film that really, breaks through on that level is La Jetée by the filmmaker I believe it's Chris Marker, if I'm not mistaken. By the way, you're listening to the Friday FARcast. I'm Robert Phoenix. And we're going to be looking at some time travel stuff today and some news items and just try to give you a bit of a different look and a bit of a different take on reality today. And the time travel piece and the timeline piece is certainly part of it. So in Counterpart, J.K. Simmons meets his other self from this other timeline that gets created during the Cold War. And it becomes this sort of interesting process around how he finds out about himself in a way that is divergent, meaning that he like they shared the same story, the same childhood, and at some point everything bifurcates. And how does one version of J.K. Simmons' character become so different than the other? Because the one that comes back from the future, or not the future, but steps through the timeline, the alternate timeline, is a stone cold killer. And J.K. Simmons' character in the current timeline is a rather dutiful worker for the United Nations. And he finds out that there's been a breach in the timelines because he goes into signing up for, not sign up, but he goes into work one day. And everything now, if you pay close attention, this is a really important thing to understand and wrap your head around. Everything now that's pretty much either futuristic or slightly futuristic or contemporary with a futuristic tone, the key that, or the one feature that unites all these different shows and movies and themes is biometrics. And in Counterpart, J.K. Simmons takes his hand and he places it on a sensor because it's going to take his handprint, not just his thumbprint, but his whole handprint. And it doesn't work because somebody else has already checked in with the same handprint. Of course, that's his counterpart from the other timeline. But you can see where the biometric programming is really kicking in. Really, really kicking in. If you've noticed the latest Apple commercial for the Apple X, it's very interesting what they're doing in terms of the marketing of the Apple X. One of the things that they've done, I believe there are basically two commercials, or I think maybe three out now. But one is where they're showing a face that can unlock the Apple X. And if I'm not mistaken, it's the same face that looks different. Like there are different skin tones, different hairdos, it's a woman in different application of makeup. I believe it's the same face, but it looks totally different. So what they're trying to communicate is, hey, look, you can have all these looks. Like you can be all these people, which is interesting in and of itself, because what's being traded or swapped out is freedom for this kind of elasticity and kind of multiphasic identity. So what do I mean by that? So theoretically, the idea is like, okay, we're free. We're free to think what we want, speak what we want, even if there's ramifications for it. Free to move about, at least here in this part of the world where I'm broadcasting to you from, Austin, Texas. Get in a car and go from state to state to state to state. I don't have to show an ID to go from state that yet. Okay, yet. So these are the freedoms that we have enjoyed and indulged with, or indulged in. These are the God-given rights based upon our forefathers, set forth in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Okay, there they go. Those are the two. Of course, they've been badly beaten, bruised, and abused, but there's still enough intact. Still a little pull over the Patriot Act, which has been sort of slid in over the top of that, that we still enjoy a relative dose of freedom in our life. But here's the trade-off now. The trade-off is you can look any way you want. You can have any face you want, and guess what? The phone is still going to recognize your true self. That's an interesting concept. That you can have this relationship with the phone that really validates who you are, in spite of all the different changes that you can have from a superficial or topical level. So Apple is basically exploiting this idea that you can look any way you want, but your phone will always remember you. And not only will your phone always remember you, but it will allow you to do things and pay for things in ways that your other Apple phones to date will have not been able to do. Now that's one thing. If you look at the iPhone 8 and some of the advertising for the iPhone 8, and to some extent the iPhone 10, Apple has gone towards, how do I say this? That the models and the types of people that they're using are like the poster children for 23andMe. You know, if you have a deep and wide gene pool to choose from on 23andMe, this is kind of what Apple is presenting with their face models, and they could be anybody from any pool of genetic influence. It's very interesting, very, very interesting. They're not going for because there's a huge trend that started just as Bush was leaving office and really, really picked up during Obama, where the bulk of advertising on TV, and it's still happening, it really geared towards Black America and kind of a novel displacement of, generally speaking, white America, unless white America is a woman. And you can go on YouTube and you can see videos where this is clearly the case. And then there's libraries worth of videos on YouTube that note this. Not only, and look, and I'm going to kind of get into a politically incorrect place right now. And not everybody agrees with me, and that's okay. But I've spent a lot of time doing this and many, many hours of observation. And you can find videos on YouTube, 45, 50 commercials. Clearly, there is a very strong case to be made in these videos that the likes of yours truly are being made to look absolutely and utterly foolish. And not just foolish, but in contrast to women and even to Black Americans, completely and utterly disempowered and cuck-like. It's just there. I'm just telling you. I'm just giving you the headline. Now, what Apple has done is they've said, okay, well, we're going to go for a different look, and it's the look that comprises everything. So they're kind of throwing down in a kind of a new direction in terms of advertising. And again, that's being liberated from any kind of either genetic or racial or socioeconomic predisposition, whatever it is. Apple has tapped into the future, and the future is a polyglot of influences. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm not making a commentary and saying it's horrible. I'm just giving you the thumbnail for Apple and their advertising. So just in those couple of ads, you can see what Apple is doing in terms of preparing people for the world that's coming. And the world that's coming is, we've talked about this quite a bit on this show, and and I'm not the only one, obviously, but we're coming to this point where we're either going to be dominated by AI, or we're going to have a split and have some different relationship with technology and technological materials. And it's coming very quickly. It's on the event horizon, and the year is 2020. This is the year where we are officially being thrust into a portal of sorts. By that time, 2020, 5G will be up and running, and I would say probably operative in about 85% of the United States. And when we are in the 5G grid, it's going to be, I think, more difficult in some ways to disengage from what we call the matrix. And there's a couple different reasons for that. Number one, it's just going to be pure energetics and electronics, because as we've talked about on the show before, that the carrier for the 5G frequency are the MIMOs. And the MIMOs are smaller towers than their 4G counterparts. And the whole idea of 5G is that it happens so much faster. It's quicker, right? And this is what they'll be sold, what they'll sell people. But when the higher you go on that spectrum, the shorter the transmissions are from tower to tower to tower. So you need more of them. And that's going to be the center. That's the centerpiece of 5G. We'll see MIMOs all over the place. And they're not that big. They're not as big as the cell phone towers that we've been used. You know, remember the old 3G towers dressed up like palm trees and stuff like that. And you had the 4G towers, which were these massive, absolutely massive towers. They're all over Texas here. Who knows what else they're doing with them? But the MIMOs will be a completely different breed, and they'll be inserted everywhere, and that'll be an electronic grid. And so, from just a biological perspective, that's going to be very, very difficult for us. We're already being cooked most of the time anyway. From a non-biological perspective, it's going to integrate the Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things, which we've talked about before, will be your refrigerator, your washer dryer, your TV, everything in your household. Like if you go to Lowe's right now to go buy a new washer dryer, refrigerator, oven, it's a very good chance it'll be smart. You'll have a smart device, and it'll be in your house, and they'll all talk to each other. They'll talk to your meter, your digital meter, and the digital meter will talk to the MIMOs. And so what we'll have this complete network and grid of all the appliances, your cell phone, any kind of tablets or devices, they'll all be hooked in to this network. And this is all planned, at least on the 5G side, for 2020. So the next piece would obviously be the car piece. And the car piece is part of the Internet of Things. And the car piece is wild. I mean, they're trying to push self-driving cars, but it's even more than that. It's the car that can actually read your mood. Think about that. So this is where we're headed. And we have roughly 2 years before this grid piece kicks in. And so I brought up the timeline piece because obviously there's some very interesting stuff that's associated with Trump And we talked about this before, and that his uncle was the guy, John Trump, which his middle name is named after for. His uncle is the guy that got Tesla's papers. He got Tesla's papers when Tesla went down. When he died, they sent John Trump over there, who was a physicist, and then there's the book about Baron Trump, and man, it's just the book from what was it, the 1920s, 1990, just crazy time travel stuff associated with. So the other thing that's been interesting about Trump is sort of the parallel with the Kennedy timeline. And people know that I've talked about this before, that when Kennedy dies, we get forked off into an alternate timeline. And I've talked about the cultural drivers for that. MK Ultra, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the Great Society, the Vietnam War, all that stuff takes us off into a different direction. But I'm almost certain that there was a technological occurrence at that time too, which I'm working on trying to unearth. What was interesting during that time is they had a TV show called The Time Tunnel, which I believe was popular around 1967, if I'm not mistaken. And The Time Tunnel was one of these Irwin Allen productions, who did Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and then later did a lot of the disaster movies, like Earthquake. And Irwin Allen was called the Master of Disaster. That was his title as a movie maker. So The Time Tunnel came out in 1967, and it was based on the Philadelphia experiment. And it was kind of hokey, but I watched it religiously during that time when I was a little kid, and indulged in a lot of time travel scenarios myself. That was my thing. When I was about 7 years old, I got a cardboard box. Not a big one. I could stick it over my head, and I colored in all these like levers and buttons and stuff inside the box, and I cut out a hole for my eyes, a little thing for me. So I would go outside and put the box over my head and start punching the buttons like I was time traveling. Then I'd spin round and round and round and round and round, so I was incredibly dizzy. And I'd throw the box off of my head, and I'd be in some other time, some other place. And I do believe that media leaves clues. And they're clues that are hidden in plain sight in predictive programming. And my sense is that the show, The Time Tunnel, was a clue. And we were being given a clue about the nature of time and about the multitude of realities that could exist. The problem with the guys in the time tunnel is they could never get back to the future. They were stuck in time. And they could watch them from the present time, but they couldn't never bring them back. I didn't quite understand that one. But it's interesting that this show is coming out now on Starz. And it's also interesting that J.K. Simmons. I always get him confused with J.J. Wilcox. He used to play at the University of Maryland. J.K. Simmons is born on January 9th. And the series debuted on January 10th, which I thought is kind of interesting, right? It doesn't debut like on his birthday, but the day after his birthday. So it's like you know what I mean? It's like, okay, here we go. It's his birthday, and then the show's debuting after the day after. So it's like almost like, two versions of J.K. Simmons. There's the version that celebrates his birth, on the 9th of January, hey, and then there's the version that celebrates the birth of the show, in which he's the main character who plays two characters the day after his birthday. I think that's really unusual. And the other kind of interesting piece here, and this is where I feel like we're really going to get into some interesting stuff over the next year, is that Capricorn rules time. It rules time. And mostly looks forward to the future, but it can go backwards as well. Remember, Saturn, and I've said this before, Saturn is at the precipice of the outer planets. It's looking forward to the outer planets. And then when we look backwards, it's looking back towards the inner planets. So I think we're going to have some very interesting revelations around time in the coming year. And, I'm not sure how much time we actually have. I mean, it's kind of a paradox, isn't it? In some ways, everything is timeless, and there is no time. And we live in a sphere of eternity, which is demarcated by our biological degradation and ultimate decay. But I feel like that we have the next couple of years here to really square some things up. And you may ask yourself, how did I get here? No, you may ask yourself, Robert, how the hell are we going to get squared up in 2 years? Well, that's a good question. That's a really good question. So let's go into the inner space. Let's go into the inner space. Because in the inner space, you can make adjustments, you can make changes. Especially during this Saturn and Capricorn experience. I think we are at a point where we can really accelerate. Really, really accelerate. Like move quickly. And the key to moving quickly, and I talked about this a couple days ago, is making choices. Make the choices, don't look back. Make the choices, don't look back. Make the choices, don't look back. I mean, theoretically, we can again if we want to, but that's Cancer's domain. Cancer looks back. Saturn, Capricorn moves forward. So how much change are you willing to accommodate in your life? That's the question. How much change are you willing to accommodate? I think, based on where we are, the amount of change you're willing to accommodate and bring into your life is equal or correlative to what it is you're letting go. Because when we talk about Saturn, we talk about Capricorn, we're talking about gravity also, right? And the less baggage we have, the lighter we are. And to some degree, the less gravity will affect us. So keep that in mind as we move through this time. Because it feels to me like and this is what the light workers talk about. They talk about a split, a timeline split. I was jumping around some ascension sites. And they talk about the timeline split that's coming. And that basically there's going to be a 5D world, not a 5G world, but a 5D world. And then there's going to be a very dense, matrix-driven 3D world. So in order to be a part of the timeline split, meaning that you're going to go fork off and be with a bunch of cool people, a bunch of nice people with good hearts, you have to make internal adjustments, which aren't very far off from what I'm talking about in terms of letting go. Of course, there's your attention brings your intention, your intention brings your belief brings your reality brings your destiny. All that stuff. That's a big kind of algorithm in the light worker world. And I think to a large degree, that's actually true. That's actually true. So we always get to the balancing point of trying to understand what's going on in the world, in the gravity of the world, and being able to discern that, let go, and move to higher states. Move to higher states. And where I think we're going towards is not necessarily the timeline split, but the timeline convergence, where whatever happened, and I believe 11/22/63 is that day. It's that momentous day, 11/22/63, 11/22/33, right? That's the 33rd number. Whatever happened that day, and we split off and forked off and went into these different timelines, different realities, that has the potential of coming back together again and having these timelines synced up. And I don't necessarily think we're headed for a split. I think we're headed for a convergence. That's my sense. And what would that even look like or feel like or be like? It could be really interesting. I think Trump plays a role in this. I think he plays a role in this. And only if the chaos factor that Trump brings into the temporal experience disrupts time. Think about it for a second. Think about how long the Saudis, look, Jared Kushner, he's going to play a role in this too because he's part of that deal. But think about how long the Saudis had been living with their hardcore theocratic state. Long time. A very long time. And in a short period of time, Trump and Kushner go over there. They do that little weird ritual with the globe and their hands on the globe, whatever that was. And then in short order, there's a coup in the House of Saud. And now Prince Salman is talking about creating Disneyland, which is the city called Neom. How quickly did that happen? Now, whether or not Neom ever gets created, and whether or not Sophia ever goes anywhere beyond some kind of platitude of citizenship, remains to be seen. But what we saw was literally the destruction of time as it relates to this long, ongoing theocratic rule inside. Now, it's still theocratic, but what we saw was something very, very different. We hadn't seen anything like that. All we saw is continuity. And the obeisance to the Seven Sisters and the oil companies, and strange kind of ritualistic relationships with the leaders of the West and the cult of Saturn and the Kaaba, the black hyperdimensional cube, going on and on and on and on. And all of a sudden, bang, there is disruption. There's a disruption. And that period of time, which seems very long, just a wink in the eye of God, is, they're onto something new. See, this is where Trump comes in and is the chaos disruptor of the temporal experience. It's really fascinating. It's totally fascinating. I mean, so look, I'm not a huge fan of the Me Too thing. I really feel like men and women need to treat each other with respect. That goes without saying. But I've seen. It feels to me like Me Too has been kind of weaponized, to be honest with you. And I know I'll catch some flack and some heat from people, and that's okay. But also look at the acceleration of that, and look at the acceleration of we have this backlog of these perps in Hollywood. And by the way, they're just scratching the surface. It's just a little tiny scratch. For every Spacey, Weinstein, Woody Allen, there's 100 more. And high level at that. But the rapidity and the acceleration of what's happened to these characters is freaking mind-blowing. Again, this is a radical disruption of time. And people disappear. There's and I watch the NFL Network because I'm a football fan and I do a little betting on the side. So I watch the NFL Network, and there are about 3 guys that were associated with the NFL Network, and they're every day, pretty much, and certainly on Sundays. And they were part of the NFL Network in-studio announcing team, not for the games. Some of them maybe for games, but mostly in the studio doing analysis, doing shows. And there was a makeup artist who said, hey, look, when I was there, this is what these guys did. They groped me. They made me feel uncomfortable. They're gone. They're gone. One of them is a Hall of Famer, Marshall Faulk. And the 2 other guys, pretty well-known players, and certainly very well-known on the NFL Network. And they're just disappeared. I mean, it's almost like, living in Argentina. Who was the guy? Was it Allende in Argentina? Or Pinochet? I always get those 2 mixed up. Anyway, just disappeared, gone. They're just gone. It's like they no longer exist. They don't talk about them on the show. There's no mention of them. They've brought in new people, replacements. It's just, so what? Again, we're in this kind of temporal disruption. It's like those guys are gone. Like Matt Lauer, just gone, just disappeared. And again, I'm not defending Matt Lauer. This is not a moral judgment. I'm just making a notice of how this temporal disruption creates a sense of just invisibility and in total impermanence. It's very fascinating to look at from the time perspective. But of course, they still exist. Like, I don't know what Marshall Faulk is doing or Heath Evans is doing. Probably trying to find a college or high school football coaching gig somewhere. These guys have money. They can. They've done pretty well through the NFL Network, especially Marshall Faulk, former player, done commercials. So Marshall's not going to be totally out of sorts financially, but they're gone, disappeared. See ya, impermanence. So this is the time we're living in. It's a very unusual time as it relates to time. And even you yourself in your own lives should pay attention to what's happening on a time level. How time will speed up and how it will slow down. And 2017 went by in the wink of an eye. And even with young people, talked about, it's like, 13, 14 years old. Hey, didn't the year go by fast? Sure did. And they usually have a very different sense of time. So keep your eye on the show Counterpart. It's I think going to be worth seeing, worth watching, worth the time. There's more going on in terms of what's happening out there in the world. I wanted to just kind of look at 2020 and see what's going on. These are the things that are predicted for 2020, and not just predicted. These are things that are actually going to happen in 2020. Let's see. So the Summer Olympics in Japan are going to take place. It's the next scheduled Summer Olympics 2020. It'll be in Tokyo. And then the World Expo, which I guess is what the next generation of the World Fair, that'll be in Dubai. Oh boy. And then December 31st, that's New Year's Eve, another Capricornian date. The transition of Brexit to the European Union will expire. So speaking of time, they have 2 years to complete Brexit. We're in 2020, on the December 31st, it'll expire. Here's some other things that are happening in 2020. ESA's ExoMars rover will touch down on Mars. There's going to be mission to study the habitability for Mars in 2020. Of course, there's probably a really good chance we've been in Mars for quite a while. The planned launch of the unmanned Euclid space probe is taking place in 2020 to study dark energy. All you people who live out near Yucca Mountain, guess what? In 2020, your Yucca Mountain is going to start accepting nuclear waste. That's in 2020. The earliest year that the power aboard the space probes Voyager 1 and 2 is expected to terminate 2020. This is interesting because this is theoretically a shithole country in Norway. I'm sure that this is not my designation of a shithole country, but I'm sure some people would think it was. Liberia will become the first nation in Africa to completely stop cutting down its trees in return for development aid. Norway will pay them $150 million to stop deforestation by 2020. So there we go. We can all get along, right? Good Norway. Go Norway. According to the UN climate chief, Christiana Figueres, 2020 is a critical year to limit climate change and avoid irreversible effects. You think they're going to have some major global legislation on the books for something like that? You bet your ass. This is really interesting. The Large Hadron Collider will be substantially upgraded, whatever that means, for that portal year of 2020. And this is really fascinating. Harriet Tubman is going to replace Andrew Jackson on the front of the United States $20 bill in 2020. How about that? How about that? They've earmarked the change of the $20 bill for 2020. And certainly last but not least, the estimated completion date for the Jeddah Tower in Saudi Arabia, which is expected to be the tallest building in the world and the first to reach 1 kilometer in height, will be done in 2020. This would be your new Tower of Babel here. Started in construction on April 1st, April Fool's Day in 2013. There's a little bit more about the Jeddah Tower. It is a skyscraper under construction in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, at a preliminary cost of Saudi Arabian $4.6 billion. It is the centerpiece of the first phase of a Saudi Arabia $75 billion, US $20 billion proposed development known as Jeddah Economic City, Revenge of the Jeddah, that will be located along the Red Sea on the north side of Jeddah. The development of Jeddah Tower seeks to bring great changes in terms of development and tourism to the city of Jeddah, which is considered to be the most liberal city in Saudi Arabia. As of October 22nd in 2017, 56 floors have been created. The reception of the proposal has been highly polarized. It has received high praise from some as a culturally significant icon that will symbolize the nation's wealth and power. In essence, it's an enormous penis coming out of the desert. While others question its socioeconomic motives and forecast it will have negative financial consequences. Let me just see here if there's anything interesting about it. Man, this thing is dangerous. Absolutely dangerous. The upper part of the tower is mostly like a spire. It almost looks like a hypodermic needle. The Chicago-based environmental systems design provide mechanical plumbing, so they're working with some U.S. contractors here on this thing. It's interesting. The Jeddah Tower. It's going to have, let's see, 156 floors. The 157th will be an observation deck. And then from 158 to 167 will be the mechanical layer. And then floor 168 is the tuned mass damper. Tallest building in the world will be constructed in 2020. From a fiction standpoint, the things that are happening in 2020, this is interesting because Mission to Mars, which came out in 2000, was set in 2020. And they've got some Mars rover action actually happening in 2020. But what's really fascinating, and the one sort of fiction piece that I really kind of zoomed in on when I was looking at this, was that in the movie I, Robot, which came out in 2004 with Will Smith, the USR, the U.S. Robotics Company, is founded in 2020. And of course, I, Robot is all about the Isaac Asimov trilogy series about artificial intelligence. So that takes place in 2020. The founding of the USR Robotics, 2020. Let's see, was there anything else that was interesting about 2020? Let me just see here. The other thing that I thought was interesting, only because it was a strange little kind of clue thing, is there was a Japanese anime game which came out in 2013 called Phoenix Wright. That's W-R-I-G-H-T, Ace Attorney Dual Destinies. I thought, oh, that's interesting. Because here I am, I'm looking at this show Counterpart and thinking about the timeline thing, and oh look, in 2020, Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney, Dual Destinies, was set in 2020 in a game that came out in 2013. Anyway, just a funny little notice there. There's a lot more. The television film Codename Phoenix came out. Well, it's set in 2020. And that movie, Reign of Fire, with Matthew McConaughey and Christian Bale about the dragons who've taken over, and fire-breathing dragons, that's set in 2020 as well. So 2020, that's the time, boys and girls. That is the time, and that is also the time when we will have the election for our next president, if we get that far, in terms of the electoral process. I don't think it's going to be Oprah Winfrey. I'm sorry. Although last night I was out and about, and I was sitting next to a very funny couple, very, very funny, and I mentioned the Oprah Winfrey thing to her. She knew nothing about it, by the way. And this is a very intelligent woman. When I told her about it, she was like aghast. Where did you see this? Where is this news that she was basically pimping for Harvey Weinstein? She said, TMZ? I said, no, it's all over the news. You can find it on CNN, MSNBC. NBC had tweeted earlier in the day that they thought she'd make a great president, and when this stuff came out, they pulled the tweet. She was like flabbergasted. I'm a huge Oprah fan. I love Oprah. She's young. She's probably in her late 20s. It's young to me, early 30s. I thought it was fascinating. I was like, wow. So, but I don't think Oprah's going to make it as president. I don't think it's going to happen. Did you see where Seal came out and said she's part of the problem? This is Seal, right? Seal knows a lot. That guy knows a lot. He's been in the music business. He's been in the fashion business, the acting business. This guy knows a lot. He was married to Heidi Klum, had a couple of kids with her, and of course they split. And he basically said, look, she's part of the problem. She's in with him. Basically what he said. This is part of that temporal disruption. Like, I mean, like on the one hand, it's really unfortunate. I mean, look, I'm not saying it's unfortunate that, like, if Oprah lost her empire overnight or whatever. But look what happened to Steve Bannon. Look what happened. I mean, Steve Bannon went from being somebody to being nobody in a matter of like weeks. I mean, that kind of accelerated sort of transition. And Steve Bannon he was not like Eric Davis or Marshall Falk or Heath Evans. He was Steve Bannon, and he did what he did. And the next thing you know, this book comes along and bang, Steve Bannon isn't even Steve Bannon anymore. I mean, this is the kind of time we're living in right now. These temporal disruptions are radical. They're absolutely radical. So if that's the case, let's apply some of this to consciousness. If that's the case, and these things can happen so quickly towards some level of entropy, think about if we redirected the energy and pushed that forward and how quickly we could move. Think about that for a moment. All these temporal disruptions are fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Speaking of which, the Sam's Club has shut down 260 stores. How about that? So Walmart ups its wage for everybody, and then they shut down 260 Sam's Clubs. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Sam's Clubs are like Walmart's version of Costco. Am I right? 260 stores. Now, there's word in the street that those Sam's Clubs are going to be retrofitted to be FEMA camps. And we got into this a long time ago, right? This happened with about 3 years ago. What is it? Blade. God, having a senior moment now. But essentially, that was around the time when some of these Walmarts were going offline, and looked into Sam Walton's past, and Sam Walton had a really strong connection with the government. And if you go back into Sam Walton's military career, he was basically running POW camps in California. That's what his job was in the military, was to oversee prisoners. And of course, Walmart eventually takes off with a fair amount of support, no doubt. But here we go now. 260 Sam's Clubs. That's a lot of stores. That's a lot of stores. So again, if you have a bit of a conspiratorial bent and have looked into the relationship between Walmart and FEMA, 260 Sam's Clubs, gotta have you raise the eyebrow just a bit, no doubt, right? That's what I would think. And I'm not necessarily being paranoid. I'm just kind of looking at the facts and looking at the history here. I don't want to go too long today because I just really wanted to get into this timeline split a little bit. And I think we're going to maybe come back to this next Friday, talk more about it. I think I'm going to make time a bigger piece on the Friday FARcast. Let me see here. Let me just get some headlines before I get into this next piece. Let me just see here. Oh, what I wanted to talk about was this QAnon stuff. And boy, Steve Crimmy is so sharp. And he left some comments on my broadcast not long ago about QAnon. He asked really interesting questions about QAnon. And I think one of the most important questions he asks is how come we never see anything about Israel on QAnon or through QAnon? Think about that for a moment. I think that there's a really good chance that QAnon might be Mossad. I'm just throwing it out there. Anyway, I wanted to read you this piece to give you an interesting take on how a mystic from the early part of the 20th century viewed our reality. And the mystic's name is G.I. Gurdjieff. He was a very fascinating guy. A lot of people thought he was a charlatan, and he's a fascinating character, though. He had this system and process called the work. The work. And people are still doing Gurdjieff work around the country, around the world. And a lot of it has to do with paying attention. Being painfully aware of what's going on all the time. And deconstructing the robot within. And part of the Gurdjieff work is walking and being very deliberate with your walking. And I was on a beach one time, and I swear to God, I saw these people doing this walking. It was the same group of people, back and forth, in this straight line. And I could have sworn that they were part of a Gurdjieff seminar. But Gurdjieff used to do this thing called the Toast of the Fools. And when he would take new people in to work with them and bring them in as students, he would set up a big dinner and he'd bring all of his new students in. And the table was filled with vodka and wine, and they would have a meal, and they would have the Toast of the Fools. So they would say, hey, you need to toast a fool. So a person would raise his little shot glass of vodka, say, hey, here's a toast to the fool, blah, 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 and everybody would toast. So this would go on all night. Then Gurdjieff would not drink. He would sit back and he'd watch everybody. Because once they were under the influence of alcohol, he could make some clear notes and distinctions about who they are and were, and could, at that point, assess them and work with them. He's a very clever guy. He was doing a radical intake with them. Of course, this is pre-psilocybin or pre-LSD. Who knows what would happen to get that as part of his toolkit. So that was one of the things that he did. He did a lot of stuff. And one of my favorite Gurdjieff quotes of all time is he would ask somebody, do you know how many people there are in the world? And the person would try to guess a number, X amount, billion, whatever. He would say, no, there's 9, and everybody else is a mirror. And what he was referring to was the 9 versions of the 9 archetypes of the Enneagram. Well, I thought that was really interesting. He's an interesting cat, very controversial, was not able to actually really thrust anybody into this profound and timeless state of Satori. He was never able to really do that. Even P.D. Uspensky, who was brilliant, and one of his top students at one point broke with him because Gurdjieff couldn't deliver on that level. He was good at a lot of things, but he couldn't deliver at that level. Anyway, I wanted to read this little piece here by Gurdjieff called The Magician's Sheep. And it's, I think, a pretty fascinating sort of take on the trance that we're in and why we're in that trance. So here we go. There is an Eastern tale that speaks about a very rich magician who had a great many sheep. But at the same time, this magician was very mean He did not want to hire shepherds, nor did he want to erect a fence about the pasture where the sheep were grazing. The sheep consequently often wandered into the forest, fell into ravines, and so on. And above all, they ran away, for they knew that the magician wanted their flesh and their skins, and this they did not like. At last, the magician found a remedy. He hypnotized his sheep and suggested to them, first of all, that they were immortal and that no harm was being done to them when they were skinned. That, on the contrary, it would be very good for them and even pleasant. Secondly, he suggested that the magician was a good master who loved his flock so much that he was ready to do anything in the world for them. And in the third place, he suggested that if anything at all were going to happen to them, it was not going to happen to just then. At any rate, not that day, and therefore they had no need to think about it. Further, the magician suggested to his sheep that they were not sheep at all. To some of them, he suggested that they were lions. To some, that they were eagles. To some, that they were men. To others, that they were magicians. After this, all his cares and worries about the sheep came to an end. They never ran away again, but quietly awaited the time when the magician would require their flesh and skins. There we go. All right. Well, why don't we stop it there for today? It's 1:22. It's a good time to pull the train into the station. I will be back on Sunday nights. I will do the live stream. I promise. Last week I was just totally gassed, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the interview with Emily and Randy will go online tomorrow. You'll be able to check that out. And I think if you want to view the whole thing, you've got to become a Patreon member for Off Planet Radio, which is probably a pretty good thing to do to help keep that thing going. Randy's computer melted while we were talking, so Randy probably is in need of another computer. Maybe a nice big fat hard drive, a tower, a Jetta tower, so you can continue to do the show in elegant fashion. Anyway, that should be up and running on Saturday. Check that out. And people asked about the interview that I did with Shima Moore. That's on Truth Cat Radio, TRUTH cat, CAT radio.com. Check it out. It's an interesting little island of information. This guy, Stephen R. Kelly, is running it. Another interesting cat. If you're into truth and exposing the world banking system, the pedophiles, all the crap on a physical plane and even a metaphysical plane that has kept us enslaved on this planet for millennia, he's on your side. He's on our team. So check him out, and Truth Cat Radio. Lots of good stuff out there, man. This is a golden age, I'm telling you. We are living in a golden age of information. You apply a little wisdom to it, and we have a solid 1-2 punch against the Dark Empire. So there you go. Let's get back. Let's get back in time. Let's get back in time. Let's move time. Let's move through time. Let's be a manifestation of time itself. And drop the baggage along the way. All right, that's it. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to state what's possible. We got 2 comments here. Let's check this out. Time is moving. Here's Steve. Steve's always got some good. Steve says, time is the moving image of eternity. Plato. And here's a Gurdjieff quote. We are food for the moon. Whoa! That's a good one. We are food for the moon. I should have knew what was going on. All right, use your head to discern what's real, your heart to stay open what's possible. I'm Robert Phoenix, and I'll see you guys on Sunday night on YouTube for the live stream, and have a fantastic weekend. Enjoy your time.